Alrighty, so this is the third sign of the 7 signs that are in the Gospel of John. First one, of course, was the changing water into wine. Second one was the healing of the nobleman's son, and that was done from afar. You know, Jesus says, "Your son lives." And so today we're going to be looking at the third sign, which is in John 5. Verses 1 through 18, and this is the healing the man by the pool. So this is one of my favorite stories because I would share this quite often with men that I would go and sit with and relate it to them in their addiction and situation, because as you'll see, there's so much stuff that you can draw out of this that will help people to relate, you know, and that's one thing I find wonderful about the Bible, is that it is a very relational book, you know. So, but so let me just get this. You have to have the pointers in the right part of the world. So anyway, so let's just get the scriptures up here, which is chapter 5 and verse 1 to 18. So it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. And in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. And then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Arise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." And he answered them, "Well, he who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn from multitude being in that place. And afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." And the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. And for this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." Therefore, the Jews sought him all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So I would say that there's probably 3 broad things that are going on here. There's the miracle. And then there is the question of the Sabbath revolving around that, and then there is the dealing with Christ's identity. You know, so because, you know, as John says in his gospel, you know, these were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So, and so these particular stories are demonstrating this. And this particular story, because it happens on the Sabbath and people perceive this to be a big problem, this is, for the Jews, starting to become a bridge too far. You know? So first ones were kind of okay, you know, in people's heads. It was like, oh yes, you know, Christ has governance over material things, and, you know, turning water into wine, that kind of stuff. You know, that was in a sense an inanimate object, but then it started to move into life of a person. Now the nobleman's son. The nobleman, you know, may have been a Jew, may not have been, you know, and but now we're, you know, starting to get into things that start to encroach on the religious affairs of things, you know. So, so let's just take some notes here, just about a few caveats that in this particular story cause people to have a few problems. Okay. Sort of when and where did this take place? Well, it was sometime after the healing of the nobleman's son, because as it says there at the verse 1, it says, after this was the feast of the Jews. So after this, meaning after the thing that was previous to that. So that's, you know, now the thing is that the situation with the nobleman's son, does anybody remember where that took place, where that? Yes, it was up in Galilee.
Cana.
Cana and Capernaum.
Yes, Cana and so the Capernaum was where the son was healed, but Jesus said the word in Cana. So, but all that was up in Galilee, which was up the north, you know. So now we're coming down to Jerusalem. So this is, you know, a good, you know, 50, 60 miles, you know, sort of down south, you know, so it's a bit of a trek. So we don't know how much time's elapsed, and we don't actually even know the time of the year, because it doesn't specify the feast. It says, now after this, there was a feast of the Jews. Now that could have been the Feast of Tabernacles, or sorry, the Feast of Passover, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of First Fruits, and a bunch of other different things, you know. So, but it just says a Feast of the Jews. Now, it is interesting that it says a Feast of the Jews, as opposed to a feast of the Lord. So, because what John observes in the gospel is that what was of God has now become religion. So, so that's why he talks about the feasts. Not so much, he doesn't mention them as feasts of the Lord. He says they're feasts of the Jews. So, but anyway, you know, Jesus is keeping faith with these feasts because it is an obligation of the Jews to go and participate in these things. So, so Jesus, you know, being the Son of God, even though he could do pretty much anything he wanted to, being a Jew still places himself under the obligations of those particular things. So anyway, and now there's another question here that rises up, is why is John speaking in the present tense? Now, if you read this, it says in verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda. Now, John would have written his gospel after the sacking of Jerusalem of 70 AD. You know, that's when Titus came in and just blew the place to smithereens. So everything's, you know, utterly flattened. So for John to say there is a pool, if he wrote at that particular time, sometime after 70 AD, probably in the 80s or late 80s, that stuff wouldn't have existed. So saying that it is there sounds weird, sounds wrong. But again, this is how John writes. John is writing as if he's back there. Okay, so it's you know, basically saying, you know, there's a you know, when he's making the narrative, he wants to get the readers to live back in the time, you know. So this might sound a bit panicky, but there are people that get hung up on this kind of stuff and then say, oh, well, if John's saying that he wrote the thing after the sacking of Jerusalem and he's saying there is, well, does that mean that was a lie? So was he then not, he really wrote it before that, or whatever, you know? So, you know, people get caught up in this kind of carry on.
That's like that where it says unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given.
Yeah.
Which be He dated Jesus. And
Yes.
argued with that.
Yeah, yes, exactly, because that's stated in the present, and yet that is very future. You know, it's another 700 years before that happens. So, it's a long time. Right. The other thing is about Bethesda. I remember when I was growing up outside of Washington D.C. Around Washington D.C. If you look at a map of Washington D.C., Washington is a big square. The boundary of it is a big square, and it would have straddled the Potomac River, and that square would have encompassed some of Northern Virginia, and which is where I grew up. And but basically, DC, as it sort of became the city and so on, gave part of that square back to Virginia. So and that turned into Arlington County. So Washington D.C. in and of itself, even though it's an enclave of the state of Maryland, is not Maryland. It is a federal district. It's not the state. It's just it is a thing unto itself. But anyway, in suburban Maryland, around Washington D.C., there is a place called Bethesda. Okay, so when I was growing up, you know, there was a lot of chat about Bethesda, you know, because Bethesda was a somewhat, I would say, well, at least what I perceived was kind of an upper middle class, sort of somewhat snooty sort of place, you know. And so if you came from Bethesda, it was like, oh, Russian. Yeah. Don't, you know, I know people on the Malone Road, you know, and they are upper class, you know. So, but I think Bethesda was kind of a mixture of sort of upper class and wannabes.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but
My favorite program.
so anyway, but what Bethesda? So I, you know, when I was growing up with Bethesda, you know, that's what I understood Bethesda to be, was the, you know, suburban Maryland. I think it was Bethesda too that actually was one of the first places in America that outlawed public smoking. And they also tried to outlaw smoking in your own house. So that was anyway, that the sort of civil liberty people sort of kicked up against that one, you know, so that didn't fly too well. But so, but yeah, all sorts of places around Washington, and people who lived in Virginia really didn't have any time for Marylanders, you know, and because they all thought they were, you know, better than us, you know, kind of thing. But people from Northern Virginia weren't regarded as Virginians by Virginians, because, you know, we were in that little enclave, you know, that little square. And so basically the Virginians would say, oh no, you're from DC, you're from Washington. It's like, no, we're not, we're in Virginia. No, you're people from DC, you're not Virginians. You know, so, you know, even though my birth certificate says I'm from Virginia, you know, so. But so Bethesda in the Bible, though, this is where it comes from, okay? And this means house of mercy. So Beth on the front end of it is the Hebrew word for house, and then the Esda on the end of it is word for mercy. So so it's interesting that there is this pool that is called this, and that is where Jesus Christ exercises mercy. Yeah. So there's a lot of Beth things in the Bible. You know, there's Bethel, and Bethaven, and Bethany, and Bethesda, Bethlehem, and all this kind of stuff. So that's all house of something. But the only Beth town that is common to both Old and New Testament is Bethlehem. So, which is kind of interesting. Right, now, some of verse 3 and all of verse 4 aren't my Bible. Well, why is that? If you have a something that is an NIV, ESV, New American Standard, something like that. Now, if you have a King James or a New King James, you'll have them verses. But those verses aren't in those other modern translations, which bothers an awful lot of people. You know, it's like, why would you do that? Why would you take scripture and basically throw it to the wind? You know, so they are not found, those particular verses, in the earliest manuscripts, which is strange.
John 8:2.
Yes, there's that whole section of John 8, the first sort of 10 verses or so, is not found in the earliest manuscripts either. So there are collections of verses in the Bible that are missing. So, and so for those of us that have been brought up with the King James, and then we hear this about in the NIV, and they're like, you know, we go, there you go, those are corrupt versions or something like this. But now, the thing about these particular verses is they're explanatory of a certain situation. They really don't change the theology of the passage or necessarily show that the Bible has any errors. So, you know, what it does say, where this, you know, the first, it says, waiting for the moving of the waters. That part is where this starts for it. And then verse 4, for an angel went down at a certain time to the pool and stirred up the water, and whoever stepped in first after it was stirred was made well, whatever disease he had. So because there is a mentioning later on in the passage that where the man says, sir, when I go down when the water is stirred. Now, if you take these verses out, then that particular verse sounds out of place. It's like, well, where'd that come from? So somebody, and I believe by the guidance of the Spirit of God, then inserted this bit as an explanatory sort of verse. So now it is found in the manuscripts that the King James would have used. So that's where that is. But in terms of looking at a variety of earlier manuscripts, it ain't there. So
For the King James, the earliest manuscripts were not available at the time of the King James translation.
yeah. So
The strange thing about it is, I know they're not in the NIV, and they're not in any of those early or later Bibles. But I remember looking at my wee Gideon Bible that came when I got whenever I joined the police, and it's NIV, and they're in it.
Right.
They're in it, and it's an NIV translation.
well, what those particular more modern translations, for lack of a better term, what they do on occasion is they will put it in, but then they'll put a footnote in it and say this isn't found in the early manuscripts or something, you know. So
And then I heard another interesting thing with it, because that's the Sino Vaticano, and the other one was from St. Catherine's Monastery.
yeah,
And they were saying that those were earlier ones and they weren't in it.
yeah,
And then I heard a guy explain at one time, well, if I wrote you a letter and I made a mistake in it, and I set it to the side, and then I wrote you a letter and I made it proper.
yeah.
Actually, the earliest one is the one that's wrong.
Well, yeah, but so
Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
So how do you?
Yeah, well, this is why I say, in terms of the theology of the thing, it doesn't make any difference really, you know, in those terms.
And would you say that to a person who's, you know, let people, you're maybe atheist or whatever, say, sure, you know, that's scripture, it's not.
Yeah, I think when you look at that particular verse and say that it's an explanatory, it's like a side note, you know, basically saying, look, what was happening in this pool is that there was an intermittent sort of thing that happened where it, you know, you have to realize that Jerusalem is on a fault line, and so there are occasions where springs and that kind of stuff will be bubbling up because of tectonic plate movement and earthquakes and tremors and all that kind of stuff. So, so you'd have this bubbling up, and then the crack was, if you got in there and you got healed of what, so that was the tradition that sort of surrounded this thing. So, there's an awful lot of, I remember going down south one time. I went to a place called Mellifont Abbey, just north of Drogheda. And then we went around to some other sort of monastery just to go and have a picnic, and just sat there, and we ran into these people, and they were talking about these miracles that happened in such and such a place, that was attached to, some Catholic thing, blah, 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 and they believed it. They bought into that whole thing. Now they were as non-religious as all get out, because they're it's like, oh, so do you go to mass or go to church? Oh, no, but there was a miracle that happened over there, absolutely, so God's over there, but I don't think, so so obviously there was some thing that was happening in this pool that created a situation where people flocked to it. So, because really at the end of the day, who heals? God, not an angel. So, but that was the story.
Sorry, well, when Jesus healed that man, and he said, like, do you want healed? He said, well, basically can't get into the water.
Yeah.
He wasn't really asking for healing, he was thinking the water would heal, but.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, that's an interesting point, but we'll sort of get there when we get to on that line. Okay. Well, so does it change the theology of the passage or show that the Bible has errors? No, it doesn't. It is an explanation of the understanding of the time. So, right. So there's a few minutes about this. So now let's work our way through this passage here. So basically, there's people here that are waiting. So lots of people, and we're told that these people here are blind, lame, sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, and great multitudes. So there's lots of them. So if you can imagine, if the story is about this, that when the water stirred up, if you're the first one to get in, you got it. So, what's the timing on that one? How do you figure this out? Is it like Old Faithful and Yellowstone National Park, which is a geyser, or as we will call it, geyser, a geyser that goes up every, what is it? Yeah, geyser. So yeah, it's one of the spouts of water that come out, and it comes out faithfully every, I think it's like 62 seconds or something like that. So every 62 seconds, the thing goes, and it's like clockwork, So and you can go down there and go and get the schedule and say, okay, well, we're going to be down here when the thing goes off, or maybe it's not every 60. No, maybe it's no, sorry, it's like every 62 minutes. Sorry, that otherwise thing would go. So I've never been there, but that's why it's called Old Faithful, because it is dead predictable. But this situation here is not predictable. So, so people could be standing around having a conversation with somebody, and then all of a sudden the water stirred up, and it's like, oh, yeah. So then you run over there and boom, you miss it. And I was like, oh, man. So we have these people that are waiting for something to happen. And so it then becomes a community of people that happen to be waiting.
Like what's going on over at the moment.
Yeah. So waiting in a queue. So we all know what it is to wait, and sometimes the waiting becomes the thing as opposed to the thing you're waiting for. So you have this batch of people that are there. But this man then gets singled out by Jesus, who had this infirmity for 38 years, as it says, and it says, so now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years, and then Jesus sees him lying there. Now, it's interesting that Jesus, in a sense, singles this man out. There's loads of people.
So why do you think? Was it just him?
You had been there 38 years.
Well, yeah, Jesus knew that he'd been there for a long time, but I don't know, we really aren't told why. It's just, I think, Jesus in his own prerogative, in his own sovereignty, does go and say, you know what, I'm going to single you out.
He was there when he wasn't making any progress anyway, so typically stopping over him.
Well, yeah, and so maybe this guy is sort of losing the will to live, or something like that. Now, could be. I
Would have been sympathetic to him too, because if he was there 38 years, I mean, when he first appeared.
yeah.
If there was any, maybe one of the older ones there, or
But he probably was. I mean, 38 years actually for that time of people living is a long time.
Yeah.
So that would be on the
and
upper
I'm thinking to
end.
myself, if you were right somewhere and there was 3 or 4 people and they were teenagers or whatever,
Yeah,
and there was this guy who
Yeah.
looked to be at the end of his.
yeah. So, and there would have been people that would have been probably had 2 legs.
Yeah.
But like no arm or something like that, they could get moving. But this guy was on his bed, so he was on some sort of a mat, and so. But it's just interesting that Jesus singles him out. Now we can surmise about that as to why, but we're not told why. What we do know is what the Bible says is that he had this infirmity. Now we're not told about what the infirmity is, but he had it for a long time. So. Now, Jesus has supernatural knowledge of the man and his condition, because it says, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time. So Jesus has knowledge beyond the natural. So, and again, this is what John is demonstrating about the Lord Jesus Christ, is that he knows things that you don't know, and can know things that we can't know. But then there is the big question, as I call it, which is, do you want to be made well? Get that up on the screen. This is a very interesting pastoral question. And on the surface, it looks a bit strange. Because to the person that is not terribly well informed maybe of what is going on, they would go, well, certainly the guy wants to get better. I mean, he's there. He's in this community of people that are waiting for something to happen, and he needs something to happen, so that's why he's there. But potentially he could have been there for 38 years. Sometimes you get used to sitting there for 38 years. So it does then sort of throw this caveat in. It's like, well, does he or doesn't he? And you have to remember about the questions of Jesus is that Jesus never asks questions because he's had a loss of information, because he knows. He has supernatural knowledge of this man's condition. So he knows exactly what's going on with him and what's going on in his mind. But what Jesus is doing is he's drawing out of the man so that he can articulate and speak out what his motivations and his aspirations are. So it's interesting then how the guy responds. But Jesus, uses this word well, and he says, do you want to be made well? In the King James, it says, wilt thou be whole? All right. Now, there's a variety of words in the New Testament that are translated whole that mean different things. Now, I think this particular translation here as well is better Okay, because what it means is to be well or whole physically. Has nothing to do with mental wholeness or spiritual wholeness. There are words in the Greek that lend itself to that, that talk about wholeness. You know, it's the whole person is whole spiritually, mentally, and physically. But this word here just purely means physically. So, but it's an interesting question in the sense that where Jesus is going with this is he's getting down on the man's level and he's saying, look, you're in this situation. I recognize the situation that you're in. Do you actually want to get out of this situation? So he's starting with him physically.
And that man has lived with that for 38 years. He probably doesn't remember what it's like not to live with that.
Yeah. And
He's
so
got that used to it.
absolutely. And so to then go somewhere outside of that is pretty flaming scary.
Yeah.
So, but that's why Jesus starts where he is. You know, Jesus is not up the road somewhere looking at your man, shouting down to him, you know, do you want to be spiritually whole? God wouldn't know spiritual wholeness from a hole in the wall. So, you know, he's physically infirm. So now, so it is a very deep and insightful question. Now, likely, this infirmity that he had was caused by something wrong he did to himself. Because later on in the story, it says, afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you've been made well, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. So that would suggest to me that, you know, in terms of the people that I deal with, the guy could have been a drinker.
Yeah.
And then got himself, because of his drinking or because of whatever that thing was, that got him into diffs. And so he is where he is because of a bad thing he chose to. So it was not circumstances that dictated to him. It was a lifestyle choice that got him where he was. And sometimes when you end up going into those sorts of places, you go, well, then I need to just sit here because this is my punishment. Because I did something wrong to my own person. So it's interesting that Jesus then deals with that kind of thing. So
Did the man know who Jesus was at that point?
no, I don't think he actually understood. All he saw was a man coming up to him and asking him a question. You know, and and that's important stuff to understand, because I think sometimes when we read the Bible and read these sorts of stories, we read the end first and then we read the beginning. You know, because then we, you know, it's like, oh, we know what the outcome is, so therefore, you know, the outcome is what they knew all the whole time. No, it's not. You know, what this man understands now is that there's a man talking to him that says, do you want to get better? You know, and so this is then why he then basically generates an excuse. Like you said earlier, he's then citing where healing comes from is from the pool, not anybody else. This is the only way forward. So
I don't think that he would have, because if he had a knew who Jesus was and had heard the stories about Jesus healing, he wouldn't have mentioned the pool. He would have went straight to him for the healing. They would have asked him.
yeah, sure.
Hey,
But so it is interesting then that Jesus goes and finds this man who knows nothing about it.
and when he was asked, did he know who he was? He didn't
No,
know.
he didn't know, because Jesus had withdrawn
Yeah.
the crowd being in that place, as it says. So, but then Jesus goes and finds him. So, but our condition and the circumstances around the condition are predictable, or you resign yourself to the fact that this is my lot in life. So, because the guy didn't say yes, he didn't say yes, I want healed. What's he do? He says, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me.
She didn't know who Jesus was.
So,
Completely different to the woman with the issue of blood,
uh-huh.
who had already been with doctors for
Yeah.
12 years, spent all her money, but
Mhm.
she had it in her head that Jesus can heal me. This other
Mhm.
man, I'm thinking, had probably been, it's like if you were going somewhere to get something done and you'd been a few times and really nothing happened, you'd be there for it, but at the same time, you'd be thinking, I don't think this will happen.
Yeah, no,
Let's stop with this, let's
Yeah.
stop with this.
yeah. So, and a lot of people that I deal with sit in this space.
Mhm.
And so, and to put it into sort of contemporary language, folk I deal with, a lot of them are on benefits and that kind of thing. So they know how to fill out forms and they know what to say on certain forms. And if they can't figure out what to say on forms, then they'll get somebody else to figure out what's right to say on forms. And it's just, goes round and round like that. And you dare not go outside of that system because you might get kicked in the back end. So I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus was asking this question is like, if you get healed, guess what? You might have to go back to work.
Absolutely.
I remember one of my colleagues in Scotland said to somebody, he says, do you believe God could heal you? Yes, absolutely. I believe that God would heal me. Do you want God to heal you? No, because I'll lose my benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually thought that way. I was like, so it is nuts, So, or they resign themselves to, well, this is what I do. But I mean, if a guy had been there for 38 flaming years, you would have thought that the guy would have observed after that amount of time how to be the first one in. Look, watch, look-see, And because the guy could have said, look, put me on the edge of the pool. I can't walk, but put me on the edge. As soon as you see water move, boom, kick me in, you would have been able to observe that. Even though the predictability of the pool was probably somewhat unpredictable, but still, you would have gotten down there right on the edge.
There's bound to be some amount of predictability about it,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't be sitting there 365 days in a year.
Yeah, sure,
So
yeah,
there was something at a certain time of the year that brought you to there.
Yeah.
So it must have been
so,
some.
Half-heart, really.
but as I would say, as a common saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So, because sometimes we go through things in life and we go, I understand how this works, even though it's diabolical, even though it's messed up, it's screwed up, and it's a mess, and there's drama, and everybody's shouting at each other, at least I know what's going on. So to have the prospect of then going outside of that, which then you think you don't have any control over, all bets are off. So, again, I'm dealing with people that sort of sit in that space quite a bit. You would think after 38 years, the man would figure something out.
It's a bit like the children of Israel when you're talking about that, when they're coming down.
Uh-huh.
They're making bricks for so many years and they're 400 years stuck in Egypt.
Yeah,
And then all of a sudden they're complaining and you brought us out into the wilderness here.
yeah. What about the leeks and the leeks and the onions and the fish and all these things we were really enjoying, and then all we have is this manna and quail for goodness sake. But yeah, it's. But I would read this story to people. I would sit down. I would work through it with them and say, look, do you think you're like this man? Jesus is asking you a question. Do you want to get out of this? Do you want to get sorted? And are you saying, not sure? I mean, I sat with a man one time whose beard was down to here and he was living in complete and utter squalor. And I says, do you want help? And he goes, I'm of two minds, he says. I'm not sure whether I want help. I'm used to living this way. Now, if any of us went and looked at how that particular man lived, we would go, you're nuts. You know, what on earth are you doing? But the guy was living that way, lived that way for years, and he was like, I'm used to living like this, so I know how it goes.
You just explained my alcohol.
Yeah. So,
And he never went to get help because he didn't want it.
yeah.
Because he was just used to living.
Yeah.
And had their own wee family of.
Yep,
drinkers.
they know who's getting the money on what day of the week and who's gonna be buying the
They
drink
all
and,
have their
you know.
cards, who's
Aye,
going home,
absolutely.
"Oh, my card."
So so, you know, it ends up becoming a community of people that happen to be waiting.
Yes,
Yeah, I've sat with them.
yeah,
All of a sudden, the question, do you want to be healed,
yeah,
takes
Yeah.
on a different meaning
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, so. Now, then we get the command from Jesus here. You know, it's almost like, you know, Jesus is going, this is really working me up here. Hearing this man go, but sir, I don't have any, and you know, there's nobody to put me on the. So this is what Jesus says. He says, rise, take up your bed and walk. Now, it's interesting that this statement actually occurs 3 times in this passage. Remember in the nobleman's son, where Jesus says, your son lives, and then there's the people that come from the place and say, your son lives, and then there's the kind of reflection of, you know, when Jesus says your son lives, you know, so, you know, and it's interesting that that particular statement of take up your bed and walk is talked about 3 times. So, so there's a variety of things that are going on here. First of all, there's the rise. Okay, so and really, this is to listen, this is to trust, and this is to start. And as they say in the movement of huge trains in America, if you can start it, you can move it. This is
quite scary too.
Yeah, this is huge. This is a big deal to this man because, you know, because he, you know, after 38 years, you know, Jesus is sort of cutting to the chase here and bang, rise, take up your bed. You know, it's like life is going to change. And so it's going to happen. So, you know, get prepared. But as you'll see later on in the story, the man does this. The man does these things, you know. So rise, listen, trust, you know, because I mean, if the guy is going to get up, he has to listen to what Jesus is saying, and he has to trust what Jesus is saying. And then he starts. So if God is speaking to any of you about movement in your life, and you know that there needs to be movement, well, take the call from Jesus here, which is rise. Now, this guy didn't know what this meant in terms of where this was going to take him, or where he was going to, you know, having to get work, or, you know, or whatever. Now, we'll see later on in the story, there is changes that take place, but he has to start somewhere. So you start with what Jesus says, rise. So, and then he tells him to take up your bed. Now, this is to exercise responsibility. So, you know, you're not just rising up and standing there. You're going, we have to move. There's things around us that we need to take responsibility for, i.e. my bed here. So, which later on becomes an issue for the Jews that are around them. You can't be doing this. You know. But, and then the last thing here is to walk, which is to move in the strength and the vitality that God gives. So, you know, in that statement is packed with teaching. Rise, take up, walk.
The gross and follow me.
Yes, It's, it would be some of that, because, when Jesus talked about those kinds of things, you cannot be my disciple unless you do these things, unless you take up the cross and follow me.
And could you not have been healed if he hadn't have?
Well, I think, he could have experienced healing, but not have acted on it.
Yes.
The guy could have said, Jesus, thanks very much, you're dead on, thumbs up, but I'll stay here because I know what's going on. It's predictable.
He was in control of that.
Yeah.
Because when he did that, it was God that was in control.
Yeah, yes. So it wasn't anything about the pool healing him now. It was about Jesus healing him. So Jesus is revealing himself, and that, Jesus needs to be trusted. And that's an active thing. That's not a passive thing. Because he could have just sat in his bum and just went, thanks, that's great. I'll just stay here. Well, he doesn't do that. So, so the man did exactly what he was told, because the seeds of change were immediately present. Because it says there, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked. Now, the word for well there is exactly the same as the word that Jesus used about, do you want to be made well? So it's just physical. Okay, that's where this platform currently is just purely physical. This is not, the guy didn't get saved. Okay, the guy didn't have a spiritual epiphany or any of that kind of stuff yet. He's just on the physical level still. But he is identifying that Jesus has something for him that is outside of his understanding and his remit, and that can be trusted. There is something that when Jesus speaks to us, you can trust it. Sometimes we hear the thoughts of man, we hear the words of man, and we go, not sure. It reminds me a bit of when Joshua saw the captain of the army of the Lord beside Jericho with his sword drawn, and so Joshua then goes up to him. Now, if I see a man with a sword drawn, I'm not going to be walking up to him. That doesn't sound like a safe bet, but there was something safe about him. Something safe about this man with a sword drawn. So he goes up to him and says, are you for us or for our adversaries? And then the captain of the Lord's host says, no, but I'm the captain of the Lord's host. So you better take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground here. So it's time to worship. So that was the first order of business. But anyway, but there was something safe about the words of God, because when God speaks to us and we trust him with it, it is always for our good. It is not for our demise. Now, there was some immediate challenges to all this. And carrying one's bed on the Sabbath was a particularly bad thing, because it says here at the end of verse 9, it says, and that day was the Sabbath, and the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, it is the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed. It is some of the most embarrassing Bible passages. You just cringe when you read this guy.
It's like a slap.
Oh, I know. It's just like, what is wrong with these people? And so it's just like, but they have a reason for saying this. So so one of these challenges, well, is not only carrying one's bed, but from Jesus' perspective, he healed the man.
Yeah.
That was bad. So, but what Jesus is demonstrating here is that he is Lord over the Sabbath. You see, the reason the Sabbath was what it was in days gone by was because God had finished on the sixth day of creation, and on the seventh day he rested. Now, God didn't rest because he was tired, he rested because he was done. All right, so in terms of redemption, the work of redemption goes on. Jesus isn't done yet. So he does work on the Sabbath because the true Sabbath hasn't arrived yet.
So Calvary is
Yeah,
done,
yeah,
but redemption carries on.
yeah. So, but when Jesus then died for our sins, then that was the completion of that work, and then we are able to enter into God's rest because it's finished. Jesus Christ is the Sabbath. Sabbath. Most of you would probably know is Saturday. Okay, it is not Sunday. It's a bit of a misnomer from the Reformed Presbyterians when they say that they talk about Sabbath school and meeting on the Sabbath. It's like, no, you don't meet on Sunday. That's the first day of the week, not the Sabbath. So, that's the kind of language that they use. Now, okay. Where the Jews got all this about work is from the Mishnah Shabbat. Okay, this is a commentary on that the Jews developed over time on the law. So because basically, God says you shall do no work on the Sabbath. Now, God didn't stipulate precise things. He just says you don't do work on the Sabbath. So they came up with a list of 39 topics of what entails work.
I'd love to see what the Message version is of it.
So anyway, so the Mishnah, there's two. I sometimes I get the order of these things wrong, and somebody knows you can correct me. But basically, you have the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That is the law. Now, what the Jews developed from that was the Talmud, which was a commentary on the law. And then after that, they developed the Mishnah, which is a commentary on the commentary about the law. So now, it may be the other way around, but anyway, the thing is that the Mishnah is a commentary on what they interpret what God means. Okay, so the primary labors, Malakha, forbidden on Shabbat, which is the Sabbath, is 40 less 1. Okay, so it's 39. So it's sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, shifting, kneading, and baking, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, whatever that is, dyeing, spinning, stretching the threads, making the 2 meshes, weaving 2 threads, dividing 2 threads, tying, knotting, and untying, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, capturing a deer, slaughtering or fraying, or salting it, curing its hide, scraping it of its hair, cutting it up, writing 2 letters and erasing in order to write 2 letters over the eraser, building, pulling down, extinguishing, kindling, striking with a hammer, and carrying out from one domain to another. See that last one? That's what they were citing, was carrying out from one domain to another. So you're picking up your bed and you put it under your arm and you're walking to another place. So you are taking a thing from your domain and going to another.
That's the problem that they had.
That's the problem they had.
Yeah. I remember whenever I was in the Holy Land, we had a converted Jew
Mhm.
that was sort of guiding the one, was an even pastor.
Yeah.
And on their Sabbath, they were coming, some of them were coming with their prayer shawl,
Mhm.
they were carrying it. other ones were wearing it, and they explained to us that if you lived a certain mile from the synagogue, 3 miles I think it was,
Uh-huh.
you weren't allowed to carry that over, say, 4 miles, because that was working. So you wore it,
Mhm.
and they were only allowed to carry in their pockets, which added up to the weight of 2-3 figs or something. It was very, very specific.
Right.
Something stupid like
Yeah.
absolutely.
I mean,
Where they got that.
And they were coming, some would have been coming, you could have said, well, that man's living more than 3 miles away because he's wearing the shawl. And the other guy had it folded up, so he was very local.
I mean, it's the height
Mhm.
of legalism and religion.
I mean, are they just doing this to control people or what? I mean, what's the motive for it?
Well, I think they're taking it to the nth degree, what they believe God means about work, you know, so it's like, so if somebody does something, it's like, okay, well, we need to interpret whether this is work or not. I used to work with a guy who was an Orthodox Jew, in the defense industry, and, nice man, but, you know, he wore a yarmulke, you know, skull cap and all that stuff, and, it's funny, this was back in the days when the internet was relatively new, and but he liked going on jihadist websites and laughing at it. You know, he would read all the nonsense, you know, and go, look at that mess, you know. So, but anyway, during this lunch break, but on a Friday, he would leave after lunch to go home because the Sabbath is from the sundown of Friday to the sundown of Saturday. Okay, because that's how the days were divided up in our day and age. When the day stops and starts is at midnight. Okay, but for the Jews, whenever the sun goes down. So so for him, well, during the summer, he would have left maybe middle of the afternoon to go home, because if he was caught in traffic and the sun went down, driving was work. So he was obligated to get out of his car and walk the rest of the way home. So that's why he left early, because he didn't want to get caught in traffic. Now, during the winter, because the sun went down earlier, he left after lunch. And so now his employer had to abide by these things, you know, because that was his, you know, religious prerogative. You know, so it was interesting.
Kelly's written that they're doing tonight.
Oh, right, okay, so
Where to get them, maybe even that kind of something, you know.
Well,
It is, that's right.
Check your spell.
I can see that, yeah, okay, I can see that.
That's what I think is the thing.
Yeah.
It's a word
Take a-
over the top.
take a camera, take a
Jesus
photo.
looked up there.
Well,
well, that's an interesting observation. You know, it's like, so what's the problem? You know, so but that's why Jesus had cited, well, look, if you have an ox that's in a ditch,
Yeah.
then you're going to go and get it out on the Sabbath. You're not going to let it sit there. You know, and doing good is right. You know, so but they were trying to find, you know, basically, I think Jesus healed this man, and then because of that, the man carried his bed. Okay, so that was a breaking of the Sabbath there, and so because Jesus instructed him to do that, then that was bad. You know, because you're telling your man here to go and break the law, right, to carry his bed, you know. I mean, it's insane. It's nuts, you know, because, you know, you read this and you go, you know, the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, you know, it was the Sabbath, it was not lawful for you to carry your bed, you know, and then it says here, he who answered them, he who made me well, said to me, take up their bed and walk. And then they asked him, well, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who was healed didn't know who it was. Jesus said, withdraw.
So instead, they shouldn't be in the hole.
Yeah, really, you know, go, you know, what a wonderful time to be healed,
Yes.
you know, because God is completing a work.
We're getting very similar these days, you know, with the whole secularization of the law, you know, it's not handed down by God at all now, it's sort of
Yes, it's kind of like legalism from the whole idea. Yeah.
So let's just finish up with a thing. So for the Jews, this was the last straw.
Yeah.
You know, so this, because it says at the end of this passage that the Jews persecuted Jesus sought to kill him because he had done these things. On the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. So again, this is all about the job's not done. So let's not have a conversation about Sabbath here, because it's not really the Sabbath, and so therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So anyway, just to backpedal a little bit, 3 times the statement, take up your bed and walk. So this is, when John writes these things and emphasizes these things, this is what we want to focus on. Yeah. So even in the midst of all this argy-bargy about the Sabbath, there's these statements that are put in here: take up your bed and walk.
Why would the man find it was Jesus? Why do you think he went back and told the Jews? Do you not want to fall out with the Jewish religion? I'm contrasting with the man who was blind, who was quite prepared to stand up for them. This man almost seems to me like he snitched.
Yes.
Well, I think it could have been that, because of what Christ did then do for him, it was then going and being a witness.
Oh, well, I suppose I never thought that. Yeah.
So I don't think the guy was being a snitch or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I was just sort of wondered that.
So now this is what the man does. Okay, he socially and geographically repositions himself. So if you see here, verse 13, it says, but the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, multitude being in that place. Now, Jesus then finds him. Okay, afterward, Jesus found him where? In the temple. Okay, now this is not terribly far, really, from the pool of Bethesda. Okay, because it was by the sheep gate. The sheep gate was where they would have brought in sacrifices through that gate, sheep, okay, in order to sacrifice in temple. Okay, so it's not far from where he was, but he ain't at the pool. He's not hanging around the pool. So this means he has moved himself, not only geographically, but he has moved himself socially, because he is not hanging with his old mates anymore. So he is in a place where he can hear God's word. He can be around, quote, normal people. So, because he knows he needs to rise and take up his bed and walk. So things have to change. So, because I know guys that say, thanks, Jesus, that's great. I'll stay here because I know the crack and I know what's going on. I know how to fill out forms. I know how to touch up people emotionally and push buttons and do that kind of stuff. But here the guy knows that there is energy that has come into his being to go and do something different and to trust Jesus with this. And so he goes to the right place and starts doing the right things. Yeah. So because the guy would have had nothing in common with those at the pool. Nothing in common with them anymore. I get rather sort of annoyed by people saying, coming from drink backgrounds, spend a lot of time in the pub or whatever like this, and they say, oh, well, I'll go back to the pub and I'll go and tell people about Jesus or something like that. Load of malarkey. You know why people go to the pub to drink? To drink. They're not there to go and hear about the Bible.
If you want to hear about the Bible, go to the church and you'll hear about the Bible.
Well, that is very true, and that's why the man repositioned himself. So, but then Jesus then gives them a bit of a warning here. You know, this statement is seen here and also with the woman that was taken in adultery. He says, so Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you've been made well, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Now, again, the people that I would work with, if they, and I know loads of people that relapse, so if they go back to drinking or back to some sort of exercise like that, usually is 100 times worse because they have a conscience.
Yes. Right. So it's not.
Yeah. So because you know the healing of God and you know the
Yeah.
touch of God, you know that God is in the midst of your life, and then you go, I know better, I will go back because that's stuff I understand. Then because you've had this experience of God, see, trying to do that, you'll catch nothing. You'll be able to do nothing. And your life will be a mess. You know, so Jesus warns them of this thing and says, see, you've been made well, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Now he also says that to the woman caught in adultery, says, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. So that phrase is used twice for John. So
Just gonna say, but does that illustrate, you know, the difference between the spirit and the flesh? Because we've all got stuff for parasitic sin up anyway, regardless of whether we've got addiction or not, right? You know, so we're all fighting the same battle.
we're all fighting. I think this is a
Like I have not drank since I was 15. I have
Yeah.
2 drinks. I'll still be down to the drink even though I've been.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a drink for almost 28 years. So I would be, probably have, temptations that road too, like on a nice sunny day, yeah, you can go murder a bear. But I don't go down that road, because, cognitively and spiritually, I go, that is going to take me down a completely another diabolical sort of situation. But sometimes people only look at the very, very short term. They look at a scenario, they look at a circumstance, they feel bad about themselves, and so then they go and they do something stupid. So
the flesh is always fighting.
Against the spirit.
But no longer when we get to heaven.
Absolutely, because we will then have a new body.
Yeah.
So the reason we have a battle here on the earth is because when you put your faith and trust in Christ, your spirit's redeemed and your soul is redeemed, but not your body.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
the body's not redeemed. So there's then tension, because the bodily appetites are going, I want the flesh, because I'm full of that, and but it depends on who you feed the most, So
Yes.
so if you're feeding the things of the spirit, the things of the spirit win.
Yes.
But if you feed the things of the flesh, then the things of the flesh will win. So Romans chapter 8 talks about this, quite a lot.
It's very important your walk.
Yeah. So rise, take up your bed and walk. Rise, take up your bed and walk. Yeah.
Mornings, we
So,
get up out of
yeah.
bed,
Yeah.
walk with God.
Because there's a guy that I know up in Belfast, and that is what he has to do. He comes from a bad background of anger. Okay. And so, but what he says to me is, he says, I get up every morning and I decide whether I'm going to walk with God today or not. And he says, see, the days I don't walk with God, it's mayhem, and now he hasn't touched drink for a long time, and doing well physically, he's not great, but that's because he's in his late 70s and blah blah blah. But so
that's our responsibility.
yeah. So now when we get to heaven, then, as it says in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, we will then have a new body. So then there won't be any conflict when you're in heaven, because your body will be redeemed, your body will be changed. You'll have an immortal body, no longer mortal. It will not be corruptible again, it will be incorruptible, and all those sorts of things. And everything about your soul and your spirit and your body will be perfect. So there will be no more struggle.
I know this is gonna sound like a stupid question, but I can ask you anyway. Are we eternal? Then in our life with God and heaven, is that eternal?
Yes, but not, it is not governed by time,
Okay.
okay?
Sorry, that's a ridiculous question.
No, that's not a ridiculous question, because, people think in terms of how we live here, so we think, oh, things change, things are governed by time, there's time and space and all that kind of stuff. Heaven is not governed by the things of time and space, because God is not governed by those things. So God is outside of that, so we will be on the realm of God, so you won't be sort of standing around and sucking your thumb and going, gosh, I've been here a million years here and it's getting a bit boring. You won't be thinking those lines, because you won't, the passage of a million years won't have any bearing at all. I believe that heaven will be an eternal now. It'll be an eternal present. You'll always be in the present. You won't think of things that what happened 5 minutes ago, or what might happen 5 minutes from then, or something. Now, if unfortunately you go to hell, that's where time still has a bearing, is because that is very much in the physical and it's not in the realm of God. So you will be tortured then for a million years, and you will know all that. And that's a nasty contemplation there. So
It's amazing too, but whenever you think of eternity and you try to get your head around it, and I mean, I've heard people saying, well, if the earth is so young and God is eternal, why did God, this is questions that people, I'm sure you've come across and do, why did God wait all those billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of years before he made us? And then whenever you look at the big picture, because when you're eternal, there's as much behind you as there is in front of you. It doesn't really matter where God would have made you along that line.
That's right, yes.
There's still the same amount of time behind.
Yes.
But we get this thing into his head,
This is just the way we live.
why did, if we're going to do, why did I wait till I'm 60 odd years of age before I done something?
Yeah.
And the thing behind that is that you have wasted all those years before you've done that. Whatever you have as much in front of you as you have behind you.
Yeah, it doesn't.
You don't ever reach that place where.
I think I'm there now, it's about 40.
Why did you're what?
I'm 40 now, so I think